All right, so we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. So basically we've had creation in the fall, and now we're going to get into some of the consequences. Cain killed Abel last week. It was really interesting this morning. I have been for the last, I don't know, a couple months. Part of what I'm reading during my quiet time is a systematic theology book by Tony Evans. And if you ever just want to see somebody that can explain systematic theology in lay terms, it's Tony Evans. I mean, it's easy to read, easy to understand, and so it's just great for I've really enjoyed reading it. And but it was fascinating today. So right now what we are on is on spiritual warfare. And so he went back to the fall of Adam and Eve, compared it to the fall of Satan. And it's just really interesting the number of similarities there are. And basically talking about how spiritual warfare started in heaven when Satan fell, but then Satan was cast out of heaven to earth, and then now spiritual warfare goes on the earth. And the God's, part of God's glory in the human race is that He created someone in His image that was lower than the angels, and yet after the sin of man, unlike the sin of Satan, He's able to save them through Jesus Christ. And that's why we're always in this spiritual battle, and how much they mirrored each other. So it was just really, I normally read a half a chapter a day. It's about 5 pages. And I did the whole chapter today because I was like, I want to be able to make sure to see if there's anything really good that I want to mention tonight. But it really is interesting. I never thought about that, and we didn't talk about that. Obviously, I hadn't read it, so we didn't talk about that aspect of it when we covered the fall, but how that really is. There's just the number of parallels between that are incredible. And the whole idea that God made us to have authority over earth, and yet we sinned. Satan was the highest angel. He had, he was the highest authority angel there was, and fell, but he cannot be saved. But God created man, and we would be saved. And so it's just kind of interesting the way that all happened. It's also interesting that he talked about the fact that Satan was thrown to earth, because we talked about when was Satan created. Somebody asked that, and like there was, because some people say it's before God created the heavens and earth, and some people think it's after. But if he was cast to earth as part of his punishment, then by definition that means that the fall of Satan had to be when? After the creation. So that was kind of interesting.
What's the scriptural reference to the fall of Satan?
Ezekiel 34, I believe, and Isaiah, I don't remember the Isaiah chapter. I will tell you, now Tony Evans very much believes that Isaiah is referring to Satan. There are people that don't believe that is referring to Satan. That say the talks about Lucifer, that it's actually not Satan.
Isaiah 14.
Isaiah 14, okay. And so those are the two primary passages. And but anyway, I just thought it was kind of interesting. That's kind of where we are. Now remember last week we talked. There was kind of a contrast and again, one of the challenges in translating something to English is words don't always match up exactly. And so last week we said, Cain answered, "My punishment is too great for me," is how most English translations say it. However, my iniquity is too great for me is also a proper translation. Depends where you put the vowel points. And so that really, since that's verse 13 and going into verse 17 and setting it up, that impacts how you translate and understand 17 through the end of the chapter. And so, 17 through 26. So we'll talk about a couple of different ways of how this can be understood. Overall points are primarily the same, but there is some difference based on how you interpret verse 23 or verse 13. All right. So the outline again, we're using a Ross outline. The world prides itself on its cultural advancements. So Cain's line developed cities, music, weapons, and agriculture. Basically, that is the beginning of civilization and the elements of civilization that we think of. Being separated from God, Cain's line enhanced their life, with these refinements. So they sought things in the world, not the things of God, to bring refinement and advancement in their life. And on your sheet, you see the line there of Cain and the line of Seth. Genealogy of Cain is 7 generations. And the idea there, again, is that represents completeness. 23 and 24 is, when we get to that, is kind of different because it's a different genre, really, than everything around it. Because everything around is kind of listing the genealogy and what they do. And then you get like this 2-verse saying from Lamech, and we'll talk about that some more when we get down to it, but it is just kind of different, so we'll anticipate that as we get to it. So verse 17, Cain was intimate with his wife. That's the same as Cain knew his wife. We talked about that earlier with Adam and Eve. Cain was intimate with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. All right. So, as you see this city and you see it grow, you see the things that are happening. The prosperity of the city is actually great. The problem is, something great with this world, apart from God, still doesn't have fulfillment. And you also can see the city, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Genesis 11. You can see the city as being the defiant act, because God condemned Cain to be a what? Said he would be a wanderer. And yet Cain settled in a city. We also can see in chapter 11, God is commanded to fill the earth, and the people decide they want to build together and build a city. And so that also can be considered rebellion against God. And you can go to Psalm 49, 10 and 12. I do actually want to look that up. It says, "For one can see that the wise die, the foolish and stupid also pass away, then they leave their wealth to others. Their graves are their permanent homes, their dwellings from generation to generation. Though they have named estates after themselves, but despises assets, mankind will not be lost. He is like animals that perish." So basically everything in this world goes away. Now, that is the Ross, his understanding of the city. Those are all legitimate. If we're talking about Cain's punishment being too much, and we see Cain as continuing to rebel against God, then that makes perfect sense for verse 17. However, if we see that my iniquity is too much, and we see that as a confession of Cain, that he is acknowledging his wrongdoing, then we have a God of mercy. What we'll find as we go through this passage is there is a ton, and I'm not going to point them all out because it would take us a long time, but there are a ton of the way that we read this and the way it's written that point to the cities of refuge in Deuteronomy. What are the city of refuge? That is where if you commit manslaughter, that you go to be safe. It's where if you commit murder, you go until you're safe and have a trial, and then you can be punished by death. And so the idea that Cain would have a city of refuge after murdering his brother, and then God, he confesses that it was an iniquity. My iniquity is too much for me. Therefore, God shows mercy and gives him this city of refuge. Also, easy to argue that that's a reasonable interpretation. And so that's just, either one of those are, so that's going to be kind of the framework as we go through these. We'll see the development of culture, but then we'll also recognize that potentially that it's a city of refuge, and we'll see some of that. So Ross, the advances of culture and enjoyment and convenience. So we get into the specifics of how that happened. Arad was born to Enoch. Arad fathered Mehujael, fathered Methuel, and Methuselah fathered Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself, one named Adah and the other named Zillah. So in verse 19, you get Lamech doing what? 2 wives, right? So he is the first bigamist. So it started early. And but God has specifically said what about marriage in the beginning of Genesis? Man and woman leave their parents to become one flesh. And one flesh between a man and a woman does not include a second spouse. So clearly Lamech is, we see the evil going on. I do also want to say, by the way, and I think I mentioned this last time, I remember reading something in the paper here, that just because you're from the line of Cain does not mean that you were a child of the devil and they were automatically condemned to hell. All right? There were people in the line of Cain that followed God, and there were people in the line of Seth that did not follow God. And so that, based on the text and good interpretation of the text, are exaggerations, I believe. And everything I've researched would say that. So it just, you hear a lot of people talk about a lot of stuff on the line of Cain, sons of Cain. Take that stuff with a grain of salt would be my recommendation. Verse 20, Jeroboam, he was the first of the nomadic herdsmen. So he did wander. So basically he's the first shepherd. And a herdsman, so he made tents and that type of thing. His brother, who was named Jubal, Jabal and Jubal, he was the first of all to play the lyre and the flute. So what do we see? We get one that does advancements in tents and handling livestock. The next one's the father of the flute and harp, which is basically the best we know, the beginning of what? Music, right? So again, we see this adding to parts of culture. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. Tubal-Cain's sister, so we see the advancement of tools. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah, and then we get the break. So again, we look at that chart of genealogy. One thing to notice, Cain has 7 names, Seth has 10 that are listed. 10 is also a number of completion, but a longer completion. The last entry for each is interesting in that it lists 3 sons. Naamah is a daughter, but it lists 3 sons. And we get to the genealogy, the line of Seth, we get Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The 7th from Adam through Cain was Lamech. And we're getting ready to read that, but he boasted about killing a man. 7th from Adam through Seth was Enoch, who kind of the contrast to somebody that's going to brag about killing somebody, likely bragging about killing somebody, debate on that too, but is clearly the opposite of one who walked with God and did not die. And so that's what the 7th in Seth's line did. Enoch walked with God and didn't die. God just took him. And Lamech from Cain, again, brags about killing a man. Lamech from Seth named Noah in the hope that he would bring people comfort from the pain of the curse. So when you look at the Lamechs, they also changed how they named their sons. So anyway, so you got some interesting contrast with that as well. Now we get to verses 23-24. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words, for I killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, then Lamech it will be 77 times over. So, Cain says to God, I'm going to be, worries about the vengeance. Lamech here, and a lot of people again consider this a boast, right? I killed a young man, if you're going to do him 7, avenge me 77 times. So, he's also the guy that was the bigamist, and so it's easy to see that there would be a disdain for life. And so he's like the picture of evil. And again, 7th from Cain compared to the 7th from Seth, that's a very interesting contrast, right? One is walked so much with God he got taken, and the other person brags about killing somebody, he's got 2 wives. But if we're looking at this through the eyes that Cain had sought forgiveness, then it can be interpreted, because notice the key words here. For I killed a man for wounding me. Now this idea is, again, this idea that it was, he could easily be saying that he's claiming self-defense. Now but it was an eye for an eye, right? So it was like an eye for like an eye and a mouth. So it was longer than him being injured, he killed him. But it also, as you think about all these things culturally that are being added, you can see what happens when man is adding his own justice system. And so it wouldn't be an equal, it wouldn't be completely equal. So again, but he did not lie in wait to kill this person. He again did it because the person wounded him, where Cain was just mad and said, come to the field with me, and killed him from there. I was trying to think real quick. Tony Evans talks about that too, and talking about the idea of spiritual warfare, this idea, I think it was Tony Evans. No, it was, yeah, okay, something different. We'll get to that on Sunday. Part of Sunday refers back to this part of Cain and Abel as well. And that's what it was. Sorry, wrong person. It's what happens when you try to work on a sermon and your Wednesday night stuff on the same day. All right. So Cain did not lie in wait to kill his neighbor like Cain did. So just a reminder, the cities of refuge in chapter 19 of Deuteronomy 10 through this 13. In this way, innocent blood will not be shed, and you will not become guilty of bloodshed in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. But if someone hates his neighbor, lies in ambush for him, attacks him, and strikes him fatally, who is that? Cain killing Abel, and flees to one of these cities. The elders of the city are to send for him, take him from there, hand him over to the avenger of blood. He will die. So you still have the city of refuge, even if you did what Cain did, but you get a fair trial. And then do not look upon him with pity, but purge him from Israel with the guilt of shedding innocent blood, and you will prosper. So you still have this idea of potentially the city being a reference to cities of refuge. So again, it implies that this Cain city and descendants had a system of law and justice to order society. We'll see again the rebellion that there is, and so it didn't work well. But that was also potentially how we can look at those verses. I've never wanted to argue with John Silly, but if I was ever going to disagree with him on something, that would probably be the thing. I think it makes more sense to see Lamech as evil. Especially with the parallel of the 7 in the genealogy of each. I do think it makes more sense to see Lamech as just an evil dude. And how far rebellion against God takes you, I think the idea of Ross, where you're trying to find what pleases you in culture, and you're trying to find that I just got called by a mosquito hunter. I have no idea what that is. I was expecting to be Madeline, because Madeline called us early tonight. She goes, I forget, are y'all having a Wednesday night? Yes, we got church tonight. But that she forgets a lot of times. So I really thought I was going to look down and see Madeline, but it was a mosquito hunter. We'll see if they leave a message. That'll be fun to see after we're done. All right. So anyway, but I do think the best way to look at it is to see Lamech as evil. I do believe, though, along with Selling, I do think you get this idea. I think both can be true, to be honest. I think you can have some allusions to the city of refuge, and that's going to come later. There will be a way to handle justice. And if we've talked about developing iron and steel, and we've talked about developing music, and we've talked about developing shepherds and tents, it would make sense that man would come up with some system of justice, because we know from extra biblical recordings, from particularly Mesopotamia area, that there are other law codes, and so there are other forms of law that get established by humans, because you got to have rules. You can't live without rules of some kind, right? I mean, if we had no parameters, what's going to happen? So the idea that they would, as they are establishing the rest of society, that they would have a system of justice. Now, a poor system of justice, a system of justice that's focused on the benefit of man instead of God's laws, all of that's entirely possible as well. So I think there's a blend of those that each makes sense. But overall, I think the comparison to Lamech and Enoch is one of the main things, because the number thing in Genesis is such a big deal that I think you can't ignore that. Any questions on any of that 17 through 20?
I do have one question now, and this might fall back to what I asked last week, but Cain built a city and named it Enoch.
Yep.
who built it? Did Cain build it himself?
Yeah, that's the implication, that Cain and his descendants built it. Yeah, because it doesn't give you any timeline.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so he could settle in this place and then.
Time does not fall in a
Right,
line.
and they're living 600 and 700 years. So, you know, if I got a kid 100 years from now, we can build a city.
Right.
So, yeah, that would be my guess would be it was him and his descendants that built this.
What's your take on the book of Enoch?
The Book of Enoch, as in,
As in, not in the Bible.
yes, it's not. I would agree with that. I'd have to read more about it, to be honest.
Okay.
I tend to not read as much on this. Book of Enoch, is that the one, I was trying to think, that's the one referenced in Jude?
It is, and it goes into like Metatron and like the sons of, it's, the sons of God and like
That one.
the Nephilim and stuff like that.
Yeah, let me just
It's all the
take
first and
your
second
favorite
book of
question.
Enoch. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's,
It's all-
we'll get to that, we'll get more than Nephilim. I will tell you, me and Tony Evans disagree on that, because that came up with the spiritual warfare today, because I personally do not believe that angels had children with men. I don't think they have the physical capability to do that. That also means that even if it's the Nephilim, and even if it is however long they lived, and if they, however long they lived, and I know the flood wipes them out later, but however long they lived, they would have been people not from the line of Adam, which meant they would fall outside the norm of what we learn about everything else in the Bible. And now, the argument is God used the flood to wipe them out. But they also say the Nephilim returned later, so anyway, so is that Nephilim giant or something else? So there's a lot to that. So we will come back to that. Hopefully not next week. Oh, it is next week. Sons of gods and daughters of mankind. Oh, no, that's 2 weeks, because chapter 5 is next week. It's the line of Seth. So we'll do the line of Seth next week. So in 2 weeks, Al, we will spend more
I'll be
time.
back to that.
We will have more on that, and I'll probably have to deal with the Book of Enoch then. But I actually don't know a lot about it. I will say this particular about Jude, because Jude speaks as if they are angels. There's no question about that, trust me. Bill Milligan has pointed it out to me more than once or twice, because me and Bill Milligan, a good friend of mine that I play golf with, this came up with the golf course every once in a while. And it was mine and Bill's biggest disagreement about theology. And so you got to deal with the Book of Jude. But go back to the Book of Enoch. You can refer to a book and the story out of it, and not necessarily say that that story is absolutely true. What's in the Bible is true. But if the Bible's referencing another book, it doesn't mean that that book is without error. It just means what the Bible says is without error. So I'm perfectly comfortable with that. That you can take a story from the Book of Enoch and make a point from it. I mean, I do that all the time. I make illustrations about stuff all the time out of culture that aren't holy, they're secular. And so you can still use that while making a biblical point. And so I would argue that's what you Bill never agreed with that argument.
You mentioned something about the laws in Mesopotamia that they made.
Yep.
I read some article years ago where they had laws, and there were some similarities, to the Ten Commandments. They like I said, they didn't have a part with God.
Well, if you get to the do not steal, do not kill, do not covet's a good way to live life. I mean, it's pretty much the Code of Hammurabi. That is what Hammurabi. That's what I was trying to think. I think that's like considered the first legal code. The other interesting thing is when you look at the law of Moses and what we have recorded about that, it is not a full system of law. The Code of Hammurabi is very much written to be more of a full system of code for society, where you can never run the society with as few laws as we actually, because really the laws, once you pass the Ten Commandments, almost all the laws are about what? How to offer sacrifices. They're not about how to live in society. That's the one I was trying to think of earlier. So yeah, you've got that outside the Bible that develops. So there were legal systems outside of the church, or outside the Israelites. All right, very good. Any other questions on that? Okay, 25 and 26. Adam was intimate with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son named Seth. First he said, God has given me another offspring in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. A son was born to Seth also. He was named Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So a lot of interesting things happening with that. Again, not everyone of Seth's line was faithful, since God would destroy the world with a flood. You see all the evil that man had done. But the instances of faith are more likely to be found from the line of Seth. And we know that to be true. Well, God talks about that, right? A righteous man, he can have an impact in the fourth and fifth generation. You know, if you're really righteous and you raise your children, you know, there's the chance that that will impact generation after generation. So if you take Seth being more righteous than Cain, it would make sense that Seth's line would be more righteous than Cain's. So we've got that as well. So the faithful commemorate God's provision. Again, we see this time, he says again we see the humility of Eve through her third son. Selhammer would say this time we see humility. Remember, because Selhammer's position on the first one is, and other people besides Selhammer's like, look, I made a man. Is actually how that reads. So it was like, I did this. Almost wanting to be God again. And but this time she clearly says, God has given me another offspring in place of they. God is the one that, not I. God has done. So I think you see more humility in this. And so they did enjoy the provision of a child. The other thing here is, word, so mine, it says offspring, you go down to thee. I don't know why translators do what they do sometimes. I really don't understand. They do a good job, and every translation has stuff that drives me back. So y'all just get to hear more from the CSB because that's what I use. But this is how it should read. And yours might have the same footnote. It says, she said, God has given me another seed in place of Abel. If you read that verse, and it says, God has given me another seed in place of Abel, what do we think of? All right, let's go back. Have I seen the word seed somewhere before now in Genesis?
We talked about, I think we talked about virgin birth. We talked
Talk about, okay, in Genesis. We were in Genesis.
Well,
Genesis 4, and I'm talking about prior to Genesis 4, where's the word seed used?
get back to the first part.
Not the first son, before the first son, the woman will have a seed who will crush the serpent's head. The serpent will strike his heel, but he will crush the serpent's head. And the word used there is seed. So now that we remember that, and we go back and we read, God has given me another seed in place of Abel, what do you think the author of Genesis is trying to get us to think about? Because this is the line of Christ. Because Seth is the line of Christ. So it's the seed. So the author is, with one word, is taking us back to Genesis 3, where the punishments are, and showing the seed of Christ. How I'm not picking on you because you're the only one who had enough guts to speak up.
That's the first thing I thought about when I heard seed.
I know. It's like Odie on the virgin birth. The virgin birth's there, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Chapter 3 of Genesis is where I was going.
That's what I was thinking, of the seed going to the birth.
No, that's true. But here, seed is used. It's the same. But if they use the word seed twice, right? If you use the word seed twice, it would be much. But I'm never going to make that connection reading offspring, right? Because if I see that, all I think of is a replacement of Abel, and I think about a third son instead of Cain. But if you say seed, this is the line of the seed that God's given her. So that promise of victory over the serpent, God has given me another seed to have victory. It's actually really a great way for the author to do that.
It's in verse 15 of chapter 3.
So do you think people like us missed that?
Well, we do if our translation doesn't get it right. But that's why it's good to look at words in the other places that are used in the Bible. That's why you study the Bible. You want to read the Bible. But it's also why you study the Bible instead of just reading it, because you look for common words. Seed's an important word. So where else is seed used? Oh, it's used in Genesis 3:15. That makes sense because Genesis in particular, other books some, But Genesis in particular is just, everything is overlapped, over again and again and again and again. I mean, the amount of, everything in the Bible is based on the first 11 chapters. The rest of the Bible is based on the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And everything in these first 11 chapters is just knitted together, tightly, respoken, redone, reset. It's just incredibly written. And, but anyway, so that's the idea, is the word should be seed, which refers to Genesis 3:15. Okay.
Well,
Go ahead.
did you just say that the rest of the Bible is based on Genesis?
It is the fulfillment of everything promised in the first, I mean, it is, one, Messiah is promised there. You see the city of Babylon created in chapter 11, and the final city that is defeated is Babylon. And then you see the final thing that is defeated is death, and death comes from chapter 3 in Genesis. So everything else, without the foundation of the first 11 chapters, you can't understand. That's why we're crawling. When we get to chapter 12, we're speed up. We are crawling through the first 11 chapters because everything, one, I just love the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But B, more importantly, not just that I love it, the reason I love it is everything in Scripture builds off of what we learn in these first 11 chapters. It's like John, the prologue of John, may be my favorite passage in the Bible, because you got 20-some chapters after that in pretty much every single passage. You can go back to at least one line in the prologue and say, here's what John's referring to. It's absolutely incredibly written. How you just keep going back to the prologue, time after time after time. John just keeps going back to those first 18 verses over and over and over and over and over again. It's amazing. And this kind of like that in Genesis 1 through 11. Everything, this is the foundation of everything else in the Bible. Where Christ comes from, the seed of Christ. I mean, it just keeps repeating the same things.
Genesis kind of projects from Christ anyway. doesn't it?
Oh, very much so. Absolutely. Don't ask the Sadducees that question, because they would disagree. But the Sadducees, because the Sadducees, by the way, so two things we know about the Sadducees and what they believe. One is, do they believe in the resurrection?
No.
No, because when Jesus comes back, they will be sad you see. Easiest way to remember. Two, they only use the first 5 books of the Bible. So whenever Jesus would debate with the Sadducees, unless he was trying to taunt, he would stay in the first 5 books of the Bible. And at times, Jesus will embarrass you if you set yourself up.
Can I comment about something before
Sure.
we pass this first?
Okay.
I know there, what we would call gaps in what we're told in Genesis. We're told
Yes.
certain mentions. But Eve just, the comment here, that's the only, she had one child who killed another child, and where we're told no reaction or anything from her except for right here. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, that's all I've ever seen.
Yeah, just, I want to know all this.
So as I had a student ask me like a bunch of questions last week, different book, but simple, just like what.
Uh-huh.
And so the line I use then is the one I'll use now. And after when I start wanting to chase those things too and think about them. So I think they're good for us to think about. But we also want to focus on what the author tells us. But when the Bible is not a history book, and so it is not recording history for us to understand history. But when the Bible records history, it is accurate. So it's only telling us, like the Gospel of John, Jesus did so many things, there's probably not enough paper to write them all down. These are written so that you might believe in the Messiah, by believing in the Messiah of eternal life. So basically, yeah, there's gaps because what they're giving us in these, anywhere in the Bible, but really crunched in these first 11 chapters, is stuff that has to do. So the part that her response that matters for the rest of the Bible is, this is the seed
Yes.
that comes. But yes, it would be, I am confident that Adam heard more than I have a seed in his place. I can't imagine, you know.
And what about her relationship with Cain afterwards, you know?
But there could have been one, because Cain had
He
the
left him
other.
wander. Yeah,
And
there's
then
no way.
what about how she felt? Now we lost 2 sons.
Yeah. Who is, what story is that? I can't think. It's a movie somewhere. Well, basically that's what the mom argues with, is I'm gonna lose 2 sons because one's killed my one son. But,
This is, actually, he's sent in exile.
yeah. But if he's in exile, there's no way for him to communicate with Eve because they didn't have telephones.
Basically, they don't exist anymore.
So, yeah, that would have to be, the other thing is, we'll get to, I think we can do another genealogy at some point now. Because I think, or somewhere in there, I think it does say they had other sons and daughters as well. These are the ones that, and that's why genealogies are always kind of weird, because the genealogies, again, are not necessarily telling us everybody in the line, they're telling us the ones we need to know about. Yes, like,
There's too much to put in there.
yeah. So, yeah, if I was writing it, the Bible probably twice as long as I would chase a rabbit or two. All right, the faithful proclaim God's nature. So this is interesting. There's someone born to Seth also, named Enosh. And at that point, people began to call on the name of Yahweh. So it really is interesting that you had sacrifices, obviously, because that's what the killing was on. But now you have people, so Seth's son, that now people are starting to call on Yahweh. It's the name Yahweh there. So it is interesting that you have this. So it's put in there. So one way to say it is a pattern is established that the apparent seed, this is the other part we see, is not the oldest son, but the one that God chooses. Now, where do we see that? Again, when we go through Genesis. No, we'll go through Genesis. Let's just stick with Genesis for now. You're right. We'll see it with David as well. With David's good. But in Genesis,
Esau.
Abraham's
yeah.
son.
So what is well? Seth is going to be the line. Abraham's first son is Ishmael. The line goes through Isaac. Isaac's first son is Esau. The line goes through Jacob. Jacob's first son is Reuben, and it goes through son number 4, which is Judah. That is correct. The first 3 all qualify themselves. So it's a pattern that we see in Genesis. Everything is just meshes together. We see this pattern consistently that the seed is who God chooses. And then we got to deal with the story of Judah and Tamar when we get to it, which is just another PG-13 moment in the Bible, at best. So this idea of the seed, though, is the one that God chooses. But these also were the true worshipers of the covenant God. And who is this being written for? Who is this being written? This book, the Pentateuch. I've seen this one book, even though we divided it into 5 books. The Pentateuch is written for who?
Wilderness.
The Israelites. Which Israelites?
The ones
The wilderness.
with-
The wilderness with Moses.
Yeah.
And so, worship at the time of Moses is nothing new, but just a restoration of worshiping the true God. Right? So we've got that they worship Yahweh here in chapter 4. So they're worshiping the one true God. So when Moses starts to give the 10 Commandments and explains worship to them, worship's nothing new. It is now we are continuing in how Yahweh wants us to worship Him. And so it all builds off of that as well. Ross's summary in this goes in an influence. I just really like this summary. See if it sounds familiar or it sounds appropriate for today. In an affluent and self-indulgent society, the righteous must preserve the knowledge of the Lord. I mean, that's just timeless, right? And that's as we look at the society being built and then looking for things outside of God to fulfill them. In an affluent and self-indulgent society, the righteous must preserve the knowledge of the Lord. And that we are to be the light in the dark world. And we must decide to focus our primary attention on worshiping God and not on the pleasures of society. How many people think that one of the reasons, there are a multitude of reasons, and we're not going to go into all of those. How many people think that one of the reasons that churches do not have the influence now that they had 50 years ago would be 75. So let's go 75 years ago. The influence of the church 75 years ago is because people are putting more emphasis on the pleasures of society. Right? Easily, right? And that's the same thing is, and that's one thing we have to be careful of as a church. The church is never going, we need to be careful with this, how we do children's stuff, youth stuff, adult stuff, like worship services. The church is never gonna out-entertain the world. Ever. World is better at entertainment than we are. I don't care if you're Andy Stanley and you got your, the hologram that preaches in 2 sanctuaries and you can't tell which one's live and which one's him. Did y'all know that, by the way? He preaches in this sanctuary, he's got a hologram in this sanctuary, and you can't tell which one he's in. Fascinating technology. But you can't out-entertain the world. You just can't. You just can't do it. What we have to focus on is worshiping God. And people have to be drawn to God, not the entertainment of the church, but to the God of the church. And so it's just always a good thing to keep focused on, because we do need to do things to draw people's attention. I understand that, I'm not saying that's wrong. But what you find, and I'll pick on youth programs for a minute, but basically what you have found over the idea of a youth program, the way we do it now, was birthed out of the Jesus movement in the late 60s and early 70s. And consistently, you find that the majority of youth, once they get out of church, don't come back. Look in our community, and I've said this at every church I've ever been at. Look in our community, the number of children that went through our youth program are still living in this community and are not going to church anymore. And because if you put too much focus on the entertainment side of that, they don't grow in what they need to. I think it's I'll do this real quick because someone's getting caught, but I think it's Sherry Phillips' story first. First Baptist Jacksonville, Tim Tebow's church. When you grow up at First Baptist Jacksonville, they do Awana, which is, I would argue, the best children's program there is, but it's extremely complex to do. So I'm not recommending it for here. It's
When
not-
it's done well.
When it's done well, when it's done bad, and I went to a church before here that it was done horrible. It can be done, but when it's done well, it's a great program. And I would argue the best children's program when done properly. Again, not for everybody, not for every culture, so I'm not recommending it. But it's a great program. And so everything's, and the one is awards. You get crowns, you get jewels, you have the Awana store. And then when those youth would move into, when Tim Tebow said he was in Awana, and then he moved into the youth, and basically you hear about his mission trips that he went on, right? Well, he gets sponsored in the mission trips for the church to cover the majority of the cost. You had to show up at so many Sunday mornings, so many Wednesday nights, so many whatever. I don't think they don't do fundraisers at First Baptist Jacksonville. They rely on tithes and offerings, and so they don't do any fundraisers. But whatever it is that you did, you had to show up to get funded for that. Maybe they do fundraisers anyway. But there was always a reward for it. And so what happens is, and what they realized at First Baptist Jacksonville was, because when Tim Tebow's age got to be 30, they couldn't find any volunteers in the church in that age group and in that generation. And it's because they would ask people to volunteer, and what they overwhelmingly got for responses, what do I get out of it?
Yeah.
Because they had been trained as children that when I do stuff for God, I get rewarded for it. And so they, at First Baptist Jacksonville, one year when we were down there for the pastor's conference, they had just completely redone their children and youth programs so that they would teach their children and youth, we do this because we love God, not because we expect a physical reward. And so they're trying to reshape. Now, I don't know, it's too soon. It's only been 7 years, probably 5-10 years since they've done that. So you're talking about, you got to wait a generation to see the impact. Most impactful youth programs are very focused on how to study the Bible, studying the depths of the Bible, teaching the kids theology, and are very biblically, kids want to learn. You just gotta, and again, you gotta be a little more creative in how you teach, but you gotta make it about what they learn. And I know one guy that had a really good youth program. He said, basically, part of my strategy is I want to teach a kid something every week that they come to church, where they can go home and say, I know something you don't know, Mom and Dad. It's just kind of an incentive for them to learn. So anyway, that all being said, study the Bible, because it's a lot of fascinating stuff and how it's just so intricate. We don't even know. I'd still say the guys on the road to Emmaus, right? Jesus walked through the Old Testament, showed down and all pointed to him. Tell me that wouldn't have been fun. Just to have Jesus explain to you how he's everywhere in the Old Testament. I mean, that would just be. Let's go to Song of Solomon. I'm just saying. I get the righteousness of Leviticus, I get that, but anyway, some of those books are a little bit. Let's go to Judges. Show, just, there's some interesting books in the Old Testament. All right, any questions? All right, let's pray. Dear God, we again come before you tonight to praise you as God. Thank you for the time that we've had to study. Lord, help us in a secular world to focus on you. Help us as parents, grandparents, to help our children and grandchildren to focus on you. Do it in a way they'll learn. Do it in a way that they like to learn. But help us keep the focus on learning. And help us to help guide them that they will seek you over the pleasures of society. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. By the way, I would argue one of the reasons the VBS works well is they do a very good job of teaching Bible lessons in a way that kids can remember it. So I'm not anti-entertainment, I'm not anti, but you want to make sure it ties to